So I think I already sort of went into this Taiwan as a hot topic thing. Here in the West, this idea of like Taiwan being part of China is still weirdly controversial, even though 183 countries recognize Taiwan as a province of China, and that actually includes the US and UK. Can you sort of explain a little bit? I mean, we have gone through this with Li Jingjing, a little bit about Taiwan. She did a pretty good and extensive sort of historical placing of Taiwan and China and the Civil War and everything. But can you sort of explain a little bit more about how Taiwan is part of China, in your words?
Okay, this is going to be a very long story. And believe it or not, what I'm about to say is just the tip of the iceberg because I think a lot of people had this understanding of Taiwan that begins and ends in 1949, which was Chiang Kai-shek got defeated on the mainland, he went to Taiwan, the end. But Taiwan has been a part of Chinese civilization for 400 years. And contact between the two sides has been even more extensive, going back like 1,000 years to all the way up as early as the Song Dynasty. Now I'm going to start my long TED talk. There's many layers of contradictions to delve into, but I'd like to correct the framing just slightly. Currently, 183 countries recognize the People's Republic of China as a legitimate government, and they acknowledge that Taiwan is a part of China. That being said, the remaining countries still do not recognize Taiwan's independence. They recognize the so-called Republic of China. And it's important to understand the difference because even though the Democratic Progressive Party, the incumbent party right now, tries to redefine the situation by saying Taiwan is an independent country whose name is the Republic of China, the so-called Republic of China Constitution, drafted in 1947, tells a different story. And keep in mind, 1947 was before the People's Republic of China was founded. So this was when the ROC was still globally recognized as a legitimate Chinese government whose administrative territory was all of China. Now, let's get into a little bit of law, shall we? Article 4 of the ROC Constitution states, the territory of the Republic of China according to its existing national boundaries shall not be altered except by resolution of the National Assembly. This resolution has never happened. The territories have never been defined. Now, a lot of people will take this as an opportunity to say, oh, well, Taiwan is actually the aggressor because their government still claims all of the mainland. Actually, this needs to be a little bit nuanced because if the government over here were to drop those claims, that would signal to Beijing we're trying to pursue a formalized two-China situation. If both governments more or less claim the same territories while administrating different parts of it, it would be one country with two entities vying for the right to be its legitimate representative. Civil war, internal conflict. The thing is, now we have external forces trying to turn it into an international conflict. Now, back to the law. So in 1991, additional articles were passed to the Constitution, and these additional articles were last amended in 2005. Now, there's a preamble to the additional articles, which I will read to you. To meet the requisites of the nation prior to national unification, the following articles of the ROC Constitution are added or amended to the ROC Constitution in accordance with Article 27, Paragraph 1, Item 3, and Article 174, Item 1. Article 11 of the additional articles states, rights and obligations between the people of the Chinese mainland area and those of the free area, and the disposition of other related affairs may be specified by law. This leads us to the act governing relations between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area. That's the name of the law. Act governing relations between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area, or what we call as short, the Cross-Strait Relations Law, or Cross-Strait Relations Act. Article 2 of this act defines 1. Taiwan area refers to Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, and Matsu, and any other area under the effective control of the government. 2. Mainland area refers to the territory of the Republic of China outside the Taiwan area. From this, we can already see that the Constitution is already a One China Constitution. I guess we can call it an alt-One China Constitution, even though the people in government today don't agree with this. When it comes to governance and law, it's what's written on paper that matters. And if you want to change things, you have to go through legal processes, and they haven't done so. Number 3 of that same Article 2, people of the Taiwan area refers to the people who have household registrations in the Taiwan area. 4. People of the mainland area refers to the people who have household registrations in the mainland area. So you see, it's kind of a situation where Taipei recognizes that the mainland is outside of its control, but it doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the PRC. And conversely, the PRC recognizes that Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, and Matsu are outside of its effective control, but still legally part of the PRC. So from this, according to the ROC laws, and the so-called ROC is the government on Taiwan today, Beijing will call it the Taiwan administration because it cannot recognize the existence of a legitimate ROC, but that's besides the point. According to the ROC laws, Taiwan is not an independent country, but a part of China, even if China is defined different from how Beijing sees it. So that means absolutely 0 countries recognize Taiwan as an independent country because the ones that don't recognize the PRC recognize the so-called ROC. And the so-called ROC, as I've demonstrated, defines Taiwan as Chinese territory. So why does all of this matter? It shows that while China is divided between the mainland and Taiwan, both sides' laws reflect a consensus that China is a single country that ought to be reunified. If you look at Chinese history, China has been divided and reunified multiple times in history, but now external forces seek to make the current division permanent for their geopolitical interests. It is true that the Taiwan area is separately administered from the rest of China. There are separate authorities. So although so-called ROC laws claim the mainland, a so-called ROC visa is not valid there. And similarly, if you get a PRC visa, it's not valid in Taiwan, even though the PRC claims sovereignty over Taiwan. This is where, from the perspective of foreigners who don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, because it is a complicated matter, and it's not like you're going to explain all of this every time you meet somebody. These two sides are functionally two countries as far as travel, trade, communications, etc. go. But in reality, it's one country that's divided as a result of a civil war and remnants of the civil war, and thus unfinished business within the country. So, I mean, to further illustrate this point, affairs between Taiwan and the mainland are not handled by the ministries of foreign affairs on either side, but by the Taiwan Affairs Office on the mainland and the Mainland Affairs Council in Taiwan. If Taiwan were to declare independence and recognize China as a separate country, then surely relations with the mainland would go through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as opposed to the Mainland Affairs Councils now, wouldn't it? I'm going to draw a historical parallel just to show people how Chinese civilization thinks of these things. When the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Yuan Dynasty, so the Yuan Dynasty was the Mongol Empire, the Chinese part of it, remnants of the Yuan continued to exist in what is now Mongolia and parts of Russia. And from their perspective, they saw the Ming as illegitimate usurpers of the Yuan Empire, while the Ming viewed the Yuan remnants as a renegade entity within the Ming Empire. You see, they didn't see themselves as two countries. And fun fact, interestingly, the Yuan remnants existed until after the Ming was overthrown by the Qing. So the Yuan never surrendered to the Ming, but they did surrender to the Qing, so that's where the continuity happens. And to further complicate the issue with Taiwan, though, it was not only separated from the mainland in 1949 following the Communist Party's victory on the mainland, but it's also very important to note that it had already been separated once from the mainland for 50 years as a result of Japanese colonization after China lost the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So from 1895 until 1945, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. There were 4 years of nominal reunification following Japan's surrender, but during those 4 years, the KMT was too busy fighting the civil war on the mainland to really integrate the people on Taiwan with the rest of the Chinese state. During that time, the people on Taiwan were left highly taxed, grossly neglected, and the KMT treated the people in Taiwan with great mistrust because they were former colonial subjects of Japan. So we saw things like the mass firings of civil servants because they couldn't be trusted, and then they got replaced with people from the mainland who were less qualified, but they didn't have their loyalties to China doubted. So of course, this was another contradiction that was further exploited by people with ulterior motives. Now, this is where I want to introduce two terms to you in the audience, 本省人 and 外省人. 本省人 means people of this province, and it refers to people whose families arrived to Taiwan roughly before the 20th century. And then there's 外省人. 外省人 means people from other provinces, and it refers to people whose families arrived to Taiwan from the mainland starting in 1945 up until the mid-1950s, with most of them arriving arriving in 1949. The majority of Benshengren originated many generations ago from southern Fujian, especially Quanzhou and Zhangzhou. And there were some, the Hakka people came from Meixian and Guangdong. And there's also the indigenous population. But usually when we speak of Benshengren, it's not really focused on the indigenous. When we talk about indigenous, we'll just point them out separately. Now, this is significant because after 1945, especially 1949, you had people from the mainland from all over China, north, south, east, west, speaking different topolects and dialects, not having a mutually intelligible language until Standard Mandarin was enforced. So, of course, you couple that with the political factors, and there's more room for mutual misunderstandings. Now, this is important because the KMT suspended democracy in 1949 following their retreat, and this meant that elections for the National Assembly were suspended as well. The last time the National Assembly was elected was in 1948 on the mainland. Now, if democracy were in place, then the people elect representatives in the National Assembly who elect the president. However, because democracy was suspended from 1949 until 1991, the National Assembly did not change whatsoever. And because they were elected in 1948 on the mainland, nearly the entire National Assembly was made up of elites from the mainland. They were 外省人. So this created a dynamic where high levels of government were controlled by mainland elites, while lower levels were managed by local Taiwanese, or 本省人. And while all of this was going on, Taiwan separatism did emerge, but as a fringe ideology for a long time. Even at the turn of the century, when Chen Shui-bian, the first DPP leader, was elected, Taiwan separatism was still not too popular. Now, once again, I know a lot of people are wondering, what does this have to do with everything, if anything, but I'll try to make it make sense. Like I said, for the longest time, Taiwan separatism was a very fringe ideology and was not popular until more recently. When Taiwan was a Japanese colony, the landed aristocracy of Taiwan, as well as the emerging capitals class, occupied privileged positions within the social hierarchy, and the Japanese colonial authorities would govern Taiwan through them. If you think of the Japanese colonial authority as the dawn of a mafia, think of these landed aristocracy people as the capital regimes. So, like if Japan were Tony Soprano, like the landed aristocracy would be like Christopher Moltisanti for Sopranos fans. Now, when Taiwan was returned to China in 1945, given how high levels of government were occupied by elites from the mainland, the local Taiwanese elites felt left out and were bitter that they weren't given their rightful positions of power. And this isn't to say that they didn't remain powerful, but they nonetheless felt sidelined. And on top of all of this, Chiang Kai-shek's power in Taiwan came from the military and US support. So for the first time, he was not beholden to the landed aristocracy like he was on the mainland. And on the mainland, he was driven out by a bunch of angry peasants. So he learned difficult lessons on the mainland, and now he's finally in a position where he could carry out land reform to stabilize his rule, which, as you can imagine, angered a lot of the local elites. Now, some of these people ended up forming what was called the Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan, which operated not out of Taiwan, but out of Japan. It's kind of like how the World Uyghur Congress operates in America, and the membership is probably not even majority Uyghur, but a bunch of foreigners. Similar to that, the so-called Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan had more Japanese people in it than Taiwanese. So obviously, internal discontent was being used by exterior forces for their own benefit. Now, the Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan was dissolved in the late 1970s, I believe. And after that point, most separatist activities were based in the United States. So you had organizations like FAPA, which I think is the Formosan something public affairs. I forgot what it stands for, but it's one of those like Taiwan separatist activist groups in America. So what we call the Taiwan lobby today in America, it's really funny because there's like the KMT lobby, the people working in Washington lobbying for the KMT dictatorship back in the day. And then there were the FAPA people and the other Taiwanese liberals who were trying to lobby for Taiwan separatism against the KMT. The Taiwan lobby today is kind of like this Frankenstein's monster created from like both of these trends today, which I think a lot of people don't get. So it's quite complicated. Now, I think it's important to know that when the US supported Chiang Kai-shek, it wasn't ideological support. It wasn't motivated by ideology, but rather out of convenience. And even then, the US tried to oust him a few times. When the writing was on the wall that Chiang Kai-shek would lose the mainland, sections of the US ruling class wanted to abandon him. And once he was on Taiwan, the US was definitely not supportive of his government trying to launch a counterattack to regain the mainland because they would provoke instability in the region. So to understand US policy in this region, region, we need to understand what is called the first island chain, which is a chain of islands beginning in the Aleutian Islands, going through Japan, with Taiwan like right in the middle of the island chain, going down to the South China Sea and back up through Southeast Asia. This island is part of the US's encirclement of the Eurasian continent, and namely to encircle mainland China. If Taiwan were to reunify with the mainland, that means China has unfettered access to the Pacific, rendering the island chain more or less useless for America. So as early as February 1949, even before the PRC was even established, then Secretary of State Dean Acheson sent diplomat Livingston T. Merchant to Taiwan to try to convince the provincial governor Chen Cheng to declare Taiwan an independent country in exchange for millions in US aid. Now, Chen Cheng refused, but it goes to show how the US thought about creating a separate Taiwan Republic for its own geopolitical gains. Then between that time and like the early 1950s, the US bounced ideas around, including giving Taiwan back to Japan. But then the Korean War broke out and the US renewed its support for Chiang Kai-shek. But Chiang Kai-shek had too many ideas of his own, and he always wanted to return to the mainland. And like I said earlier, this would have threatened regional stability and ruined US designs for the region. So, when the US sent the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, it wasn't only to prevent the communists from coming to Taiwan, it was also to prevent Chiang Kai-shek from launching a counterattack. Now, during this time, for extra insurance, the US began covertly supporting Taiwan separatists as controlled opposition against Chiang Kai-shek, while overtly supporting Chiang Kai-shek against the communists. So people need to know, Taiwan separatism was not always against the Communist Party of China. It was originally against Chiang Kai-shek, and the US used this to its advantage to keep Chiang Kai-shek under its control. Now, these separatists later on, like liberal elements joined, and they were inspired by US liberal democracy. So there was this trend where they were anti-KMT, anti-Chiang Kai-shek, but pro-US. So, yeah. Back when the PRC was in a much weaker position than it is today, it could not have done much if an independent Taiwan were declared. So the US tried hard to make it happen, but Chiang Kai-shek, for all of his faults, would not allow that. Now, I want to introduce a concept. It was called the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status, which is what a lot of separatists like to quote to justify Taiwan as an independent country. When the Treaty of San Francisco was signed in 1950, and the Treaty of San Francisco was the treaty that finalized all the peace settlements between the Allies and Japan after World War II. The US purposely left Beijing and Taipei out of the treaty and worded the treaty so that Japan only surrendered Taiwan, but did not mention who Japan surrendered it to. That way, the US could argue that Japan had only surrendered Taiwan and that Taiwan was just being administered by the Chiang Kai-shek clique until final arrangements were made. However, this theory was nullified by the US itself when it concluded the Sino-US Joint Defense Treaty with Chiang Kai-shek in 1954, which defined Taiwan and Penghu, or what they called Formosa and the Pescadores, as territories of the Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek was not happy because he wanted the territories of the Republic of China to be defined as the entirety of China. But at the very least, there is a signed document, official document, that the US signed in an official capacity that defined Taiwan as ROC territory. And of course, this treaty was nullified when the US established diplomatic ties with Beijing and acknowledged Beijing's stance that the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China and that Taiwan's a part of China. And according to the UN, the PRC is a successor state of the ROC. So what's ROC territory is essentially PRC territory, unless there are further treaties redefining the borders, as we saw with, Mongolia. Outer Mongolia is considered ROC territory, but the PRC finalized the border dispute and recognized Mongolian independence. Now, when the US established diplomatic ties with Beijing, I'm almost done by the way, the US began pursuing a strategy called strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan, in which it does not challenge the one China policy, but it also says that, our position is we just acknowledge your positions that Taiwan's a part of China. We're not going to fully commit to recognizing that Taiwan is a part of the PRC. Now, at the same time, the US will not outright support Taiwan separatism because it does not want to rock the boat with the mainland. But what it will do is support Taiwan's democracy. So then they'll covertly support these separatists and then have these separatists say that they're fighting for democracy and support democracy. It's kind of like laundering money. You're basically doing the same thing, but you're adding layers to it to obfuscate your true intentions. It's kind of like how back in the day, the US recognized the ROC and acknowledged Taipei's claims that the mainland also belonged to the ROC, but not actively uphold this claim. So when the liberal opposition movement against the KMT kicked off back in late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the US supported the liberal opposition against the KMT, and this liberal opposition gave birth to the Democratic Progressive Party. or the DPP, which is the party that's incumbent today. There was also a shift in the US because during the Cold War, the US supported strongmen like Chiang Kai-shek and later his son Jiang Jingguo, because these types of strongmen were what was needed to make sure that communists would not take power. But with the waning of the communist threat from the socialist bloc, which was beginning to fall apart, the US preferred liberal governments in its spheres of influence, since people like the Chiangs had too many ideas of their own and did not always align with US interests. And also because supporting democratic governments was a better look for America, not to mention a liberal democracy is much more malleable and easy to influence. So the US supported like the liberal developments in Taiwan. And as soon as the ban on opposition parties was lifted in Taiwan in 1987, the Taiwan separatists who operated for decades in exile started pouring back into Taiwan. And the way that these separatists won support in Taiwan was to play on and exacerbate divisions, like for example, between 本省人 and 外省人. Because, for the longest time, upper levels of government were dominated by the elites from the mainland. And it was easy to sell to local Taiwanese or 本省人 that Taiwan ought to be governed by Taiwanese people for the Taiwanese people and to associate like corruption with the mainlanders who arrived in 1949. But if you look at it, the majority of mainlanders who arrived to Taiwan in 1949 came from working class and peasant backgrounds and did not really enjoy privileges in Taiwan. Things actually sucked a lot for them because they were here, they were poor, they faced discrimination, they couldn't go back to the mainland because, martial law. So they were stuck here, a lot of them against their will, and couldn't reunite with their families until 1988. Now, not to mention, the victims of most political executions were actually mainlanders as opposed to local Taiwanese, because mainlanders were more likely to have contact with communists and thus be suspected communists. Today, the separatists will try to frame the victims of martial law as heroes of Taiwan separatism, but no. Most of them were suspected communists. You had this going on, and meanwhile, when Jiang Jingguo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, died, his successor Li Denghui, who represented the liberal faction of the KMT, began purging the KMT of the Bonapartist faction and began liberalizing Taiwan both economically and politically. In the past, it was impossible to declare an independent Taiwan because Taiwan separatism was one, a fringe ideology, and two, Chiang Kai-shek opposed it. But today it's impossible because the Chinese mainland is in a position where it could respond. So the US does not outright support separatism. It does not support the creation of an independent Taiwan, but it wants to maintain the status quo while it wants separatist ideas to spread in Taiwan and for a distinct identity to form so that the people do not want reunification. Because by doing this, the US can maintain the division of China without stepping on Beijing's red line of supporting Taiwan separatism while making it increasingly difficult for Beijing to pursue reunification. And we can see this when the US actually intervened in the 2000s and told Chen Shui-bian, the first DPP member to ever be elected the leader of the Taiwan area, to tone down his separatist rhetoric. Another factor having to do with the 本省人 外省人 divide is population today is around 15% 外省人. So like there are people whose families arrived from the mainland in 1949. They're the ones with more immediate attachments and emotional attachments to the mainland because, they grow up hearing stories about their parents and grandparents coming from the mainland. Whereas the remaining majority of the population is many generations removed from the mainland. My mother, for example, she's 6 generations removed from the mainland, but her generation still tends to identify as Chinese because they were taught in school from a young age that we're Chinese. So to wrap this up, there are many layers of complicated contradictions in Taiwan society, and there's a ruling elite in the West that's eager to exploit and exacerbate these internal contradictions to further their geopolitical aims, namely to keep Taiwan outside of Beijing's administration. So nothing else really matters to the global elites.